Hello and welcome to WNHH Radio's Dateline New Haven. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make the Elm City tick. Pat Dillon has been making New Haven tick for a long time. She's been in elected office for 40 years.
Is that true?
Is it true? What was the first year? Like 78, right?
Maybe, right.
Yeah, okay. We're close enough. Since 1985, Pat has represented New Haven's 92nd district in the Connecticut General Assembly. Over that time, both in office and in community work, Pat has been at the forefront of issues involving abuse against women. There's a lot to talk about that subject in the news these days, and Pat has come here to help us do that. Welcome back to the WNHA studio, Representative Pat Dillon.
Good morning.
And she's always much tech savvier than I've been my whole life. I've always been one step behind Pat, and she's now trying to share this on Facebook. And I want to thank Yale New Haven Hospital for providing support for today's program. So, Pat, a lot of what I want to talk about today, Pat, involves state laws, proposed state laws protecting women against harassment and violence. But given your history of working not just on laws, but in Rape Crisis Center, I guess I got to ask you the obvious question is, what was your reaction to the hearings of Brett Kavanaugh? What did it tell you about the state of the national debate over violence against women, treatment of women?
That we need to keep working on it. And I've seen this at the Capitol too. So, and I see it in the New Haven Police Department. I think it's always going to be an endemic issue, and you have to keep making the case.
What is it that you see in the Capitol and Police Department that echoes what you heard in the Kavanaugh hearings?
Part of what we do is not just write laws. We have to change the institutional culture. And we have to organize within the community, which is something that we did in New Haven when we started the Battered Women's Shelter. I spent probably as much or more time speaking at churches in the community than I did up at the Capitol. There were other people who did that, and did training in the police department. So it seemed to us that using just the force of the law was never going to be quite enough, and there's been a generational shift, which is a normal churn. What
kind of shift?
Well, I'm answering about the Kavanaugh, but I want to use an example from the state capitol. A year ago, the Connecticut Civil Liberties Union proposed a bill concerning women, incarcerated women. And the fact pattern that they used was that women who were in labor were being put in chains. Now, this was stunning to me because we actually worked on a consent decree based on the same fact pattern before I was elected to anything. I was at the Battered Women's Shelter then. We were taking hotline calls. A number of women had gone to Niantic. That's
the state prison for
which
women.
Which is the state prison. They had no access to a library. They had no access to either Alcohol Anonymous or narcotic, any kind of support groups for people with addiction. There were very specific issues involving their children, and there was a case of women who were going into labor. That became a consent decree that was in force for 30 years. And amazingly, they then this year decided to put it in statute because there has been slippage within the department.
Where women who are pregnant are put in restraints.
Right. That's right.
Any woman who's pregnant is the concern. Women who are later in pregnancy, is there concern that it would...
Women in incarceration who went into labor were considered a flight risk. They would try to run away.
If they were in labor?
Yeah.
How do you run away when you're in labor?
Okay.
So this law passed?
The law did pass, but it taught me a lesson.
What was the lesson?
That we had used the coercion of the courts originally, and I was very deeply involved in that, and I was on the board of a group that helped provide them the Coalition for Women in Prison with their original funding. And but there had been generational churn, and the institutional culture in corrections had gradually slipped back to where they were before.
With a lack of understanding of some basics about issues involving women
in the
criminal justice system, which we hear a lot in domestic violence. Do you remember the Tracy Thurman case in the 80s when it led to a lawsuit and changes in policy of you don't just routinely arrest the woman who complains of domestic violence along with the man who beat her up?
Mm-hmm.
But I guess isn't that another lesson that often has to be retaught to police officers?
Yes.
Okay, so then it was interesting. He's talking about relearning the lessons. So in Kavanaugh, we had a very divided country about how violence against women actually works. You see a lot of people, including women, quoted, but more men, saying that she couldn't. Dr. Ford could not have been telling the truth because she would have told somebody or she would have remembered all the details. What was it like to hear that, and how do you feel about the fact that half the country sees it that way?
Well, I think they were confused. It came out of nowhere. I was surprised. I had problems with Kavanaugh's rulings when he was in his dissent and when he was on the appellate court. So I had real problems with him, and they never got discussed. Actually, what a threat he poses on the Supreme Court. But so this kind of came out of left field for a lot of people. I think some people distrusted it because it came out of nowhere. And some people distrusted it because it was in their interest to do so, because they were on board for Kavanaugh and they were very good at messaging. And some people blamed Senator Feinstein, which I think is really unfortunate because she was asked by Dr. Ford to keep her name confidential, and she respected that. And you really can't put people leak people's names without their consent. It would be wrong.
So a lot of concern. You're talking about Judge's record. A lot of concerns about Kavanaugh before the issue of his personal conduct came up was what's going to be the future of Roe versus Wade and legalized abortion. You just mentioned a case in Connecticut with policy toward corrections officers and incarcerated pregnant women about where a court order didn't work. You had to change the law.
It did work.
For a while.
It worked for a long time.
One concern, one criticism of Roe from people on both sides of the aisle, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who would want to keep Roe, is that was an issue that was a mistake to settle through legal ruling, that it should have been settled through legislation. They feel that way about civil rights. So people like Kavanaugh and Jeff Sessions and others who oppose civil rights law and laws helping women often say they have ideological reasons for being against those laws, and they want it those rulings by a court, and they want it democratically decided because they feel they'd win the democratic fight. But people on the other side of that often feel that it's harder work to get legislation passed, but in fact that's more enduring, and that's the way you don't have to worry about going backwards. Do you think that there might be a fight now over Roe, and will it go to state houses, and might we have one country within the United States where abortion is legal and one country where it's not?
Well, that's been happening already.
Right, in Texas, you can't get abortion.
That's right. And the first, I know a lot of people love Justice Kennedy, and he was okay on some things, but I have a much lower view of him, although he seems amiable. The weaponizing of the First Amendment, so that the right, whether you're looking at Hobby Lobby or you're looking at their whole,
right, they're using the First Amendment in a much expanded way, which is helping institutions discriminate in the name of free speech.
Right. Or I don't want to support your abortions, except that we're not supporting your abortion because the Hyde Amendment precludes that. I don't want to support any organization that does that. Therefore, I want to be able to opt out of X. And the problem with an individual rights analysis, and that's true no matter who you are, is at what point you come to common ground. Mm-hmm. Is there going to be any community? And because I shout louder and I got to court first, am I going to be the one whose right trumps everybody else? Or are we going to try to build an argument that we should have some kind of common space where we agree we're going to take care of each other?
Okay, and we're taking care of talking about violence against women, other issues involving women in the courts and in law, with Pat Dillon, state representative from New Haven since 1985. Has a long history of working on women's issues in the legislature and at the grassroots, and she's here on Dateline New Haven on WNHH-FM, your home for community radio at 103.5 FM. Pat Dillon, you were speaking in passing about the culture in police departments.
Mm-hmm.
We had a story recently in the New Haven Independent about how 4 different police officers were arrested in New Haven this summer on charges of domestic abuse. Did that surprise you?
Maybe, yeah, it did. Well, first of all, New Haven historically had a much better record than a lot of other police departments, and when the movement started, which was not started by me, although I was the first
What
director
movement?
of the battered women's movement in New Haven, in Connecticut. I was the first director of the shelter, but I was working as a researcher, and I was kind of recruited and raised money for them. The the New Haven Police Department was much better, actually, than, let's say, the New York City Police Department, where you could go to Brooklyn and find out that half the women there, were married to police officers. There were always very outstanding cases that everybody knew about that they didn't discuss because
Are you saying that in other places there was a proclivity for police officers to commit domestic violence on a larger scale than other people?
No, I don't think it's on a larger scale. I think it's because they have unique positions of power and coercion over the rest of us. They have arrest powers, so that even though the numbers, I have no idea what the percentage numbers would
But
be.
you said half the women in the Brooklyn shelter.
Right.
That's huge. There's not half the people
That
in
was in
society.
1977.
But why was that?
Because they had no other recourse. They couldn't call the police. Because
so it might not be that there's more domestic violence, it's that the victims might be more likely to seek an alternative to the police for help.
Right. The violence on the part of a police officer is a much, much bigger deal than someone who's an accountant. Even though I certainly respect accountants. My father was one, but
so is it just a blip?
They carry guns. They have the power to arrest you. And so if you know that the guy who shows up at your door is doing that at home, you're not gonna trust the authority of the police, and you're not gonna.
And one case involved a lieutenant in New Haven who kept his family hostage for days and had a cache of guns there that he'd point to and made threats, and is in charge of a policing district, or was. Any thoughts about the significance of that? Should the police have known earlier? Should they have read the tea leaves on that one?
Well, I have a very high opinion of Chief Campbell. I mean, he's been very responsive on a number of issues that I knew about. So I don't know when any of these people were hired, but if you're getting to the sort of generational churn, there were a couple of stories that you told in that article, and one, obviously there's an issue with screening. And I know that the New Haven Police Department does not do the standard screening pre-hire. And obviously, if you don't do it at the front end, you're going to have more problems.
What kind of
later.
screening you talk about? Because they do psychological testing. They look at your criminal record.
Well, they don't follow the same standards as I believe as some of the
what kind of standards
international, the IAPC.
But what kind of standards for what?
Well, I would have to find out what. But when I was starting to look at that particular case, there were a number of people at the Capitol who are nonpartisan folks who were raising questions about the screening process.
And I asked the police, is this unusual? For a couple months, 4 different cops arrested for domestic violence. They said that it's a problem, but that, it's kind of a blip. There's always some cases. They're an organization with, right now we have about 400 people in uniform. 4 out of 400 seemed like a lot. They said that it's not always, you don't usually see that many. That was a blip, but that in any organization, domestic violence is rampant enough that you're going to encounter it. And that one problem they encountered was that they often talk about employee assistance programs, EAP, to go get help. And one of the assistant chiefs, Tony Reyes, went back to line up after the article and said, and after the incidents, and said, you got to go to EAP. A lot of people feel they can't because it's not macho or it shows you're weak or you don't really need the help. They felt the answer lay in pushing a EAP more, that was the root of the issue. I wondered whether they should have seen warning signals, or is that Monday morning quarterbacking because it's so prevalent in our society? Guy hadn't shown up for work for a couple of days. This was going on in this house on the East Shore. What do you think?
Well, there was one case, and I may be conflating more than 2 cases, where there was an order of protection.
That was different. That was violation of order of protection. That was a cop who lives in Brantford.
And I don't know whether that police officer in Brantford was still allowed to carry a gun.
Not during the investigation, but once that officer was cleared, he's back on the force.
But at the time of that incident, he had a protective order.
Right. Oh, I see. Should you be carrying a gun when there's a protective order?
We adopted legislation in 2016 that specifically addresses that issue.
How interesting.
I don't want to, and it was very difficult because 2 members of our caucus are police officers, or were And so we had some healthy, loving conversations on the Judiciary Caucus about what it would mean to an officer to have his gun taken away.
So
And
is it state law now that if you have a protective order against you of any kind, you can't have a gun?
there is a weasel language, excuse me, that something about the violent intent. So I can get you the language.
Right. This protective order did not involve violent intent. I'm pretty sure of that. So yeah, that'd be interesting to follow up on.
But you don't have to be limited by the law. You
Right.
could say what we have adopted on the state level addresses the issue of police officers who have ex parte orders that that affect their behavior in some way or were driven by their behavior. And it could be department policy that you look behind that and say, you know, the law says you had to have X violent intent. I think some of the issues that were discussed there were alarming. So, but just the fact of anybody who's had an ex parte order, that would be a red flag for me.
Right.
On a hire, that would be a red flag, and when they're out on the street carrying a gun, that would be a red flag.
So you mentioned Chief Anthony Campbell and his interest in the issue of domestic violence. When he became the chief a year ago, he said that, I guess more than a year ago now, he said one of his top priorities was to start a new center run by a former police captain, Julie Johnson, who was involved in these issues, to help battered women, a one-stop shopping for battered women to make it easier to get help and sent to other resources, and to help the batterers, to help people accused of domestic violence get help as well. There's going to be a fundraiser for that soon. They're along the way of that. How do you know about this project and what's your
I think there was a press conference I was invited to by some of the people I had worked with years ago because they were part of it. I don't know about that particular event, though.
What do you think about the? Is there enough services? Are there enough services for people who batter? And is it important to have them in the loop too? And if so, how?
Yeah, there should be. My mindset, because it's still kind of in the shelter, is I'm more worried about the children of the.
Well, we have family shelters now, correct? I mean, there are places where you don't know where to find them because they don't want people to track down people.
Right, but what I learned when we had the shelter, and particularly when I had to take a family into my house, which was a real test of a new marriage, was, but it was because the husband was had tracked her down to our shelter, had followed us from the pediatrician's office, that the male children sometimes act out against the mother. They blame the mother for not protecting themselves, or they may be parroting their father's behavior. But I was alarmed at very early ages, at the way some of the little boys were acting. And some of them also had an exaggerated sense of, protecting their mothers. But there was also hostility.
Bill Clinton had some of that,
kids.
Didn't he?
Maybe.
He was mad about his mother being beat up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, in this case, it would be pushing your mother because you're mad at your mother. Because either she didn't protect you because the father hit you too, or she didn't protect herself. There would be, and she's there, and he's not. Mm-hmm. So we actually early on had recruited men to be caregivers at the shelter, which had to be worked out, because it was sort of but it was something that we identified very early on in the program.
What kind of help do people get now in New Haven? What has been the successor to the rape crisis shelter? That
was a battered women's shelter. That organization was absorbed into an umbrella organization that's in North Haven. I would say if you were going to ask me what I'm most worried about, and I don't know, I think there's a long list. The women in the big cities very often attach tremendous amount of power to the orders of protection when they go to court. And very often they're not delivered in the big cities.
I remember Martin Lee had the bill about making sure they're delivered.
Right. And that is an ongoing issue. And
a lot of the deliverers are male, kind of traditional male, right? They would often sympathize with or they just didn't want to do the work.
They don't make any money on it. I think it comes down to that. Or they have to go to bad neighborhoods. I don't know. I think we need to chase that a little bit more, but I think the service component has been in Greater New Haven has been pretty good. Um, the problem is that the access problem, I think, is an issue. Especially if women are going to court, which is very difficult, and getting orders that they attach tremendous power on, and or they think, well, you have his record now. I've called the police. I've gone to, and the reality is the guy, who comes out to your house doesn't necessarily know that. We've tried to change that on the ground, but you have to serve the papers. So we have to monitor that all the time.
All right, and we're monitoring women's issues and the law with State Representative Pat Dillon of New Haven.
I did want to add something about the Kavanaugh case before we went away from him, because there were so many threads in the Kavanaugh case that we could have a series on him and what he's about. But there was something that I had not given enough weight to before, and I'm thinking a lot more now, and that is the young people who grew up in the 80s. And if you grew up where basically 16 Candles or a whole bunch of other movies were the normal, where a victory was getting the pretty girl drunk and passing her around. I'm not saying that there's an excuse for the behavior of Kavanaugh if he did it. They never interviewed any of the corroborated potential people who could corroborate it, but she was very, very credible, very credible. And she gave up the name of a witness who was a friend of his, which could have been against her legal interest. It really worries me, the mix of things that are going on in that story, and that is that there was almost permission to rape women in our popular culture. There also sort of was a backstop in that we had access to birth control, that there may have been kind of a hookup culture going on, or even a rape culture, but at least the women could have access to birth control. Some of the same men who were, to put it mildly, sexually active in their youth, and I won't name them, but some of them are very powerful, are now kind of making their mark politically, and it may have been a career move, maybe it's a real belief of faith, to limit access to birth control, which they call abortion, and to chip away at Roe Wade.
I always wondered if there could be a large meeting of minds between many anti and pro-abortion people on birth control. I understand for some religious people, they think it's murder or abortion, but for so many people, what you want to avoid is unwanted pregnancy. Is there? I remember Mary Mashinsky, the state rep from Wallingford, used to say she felt there was real potential for common ground among most people who consider themselves pro-life or pro-choice, and that one of those areas would be birth control. Do you think the feeling of birth control as abortion is wide enough that isn't possible from what you've observed politically at the Capitol?
I heard what Justice Kavanaugh said.
What did he say?
He was quoting his dissent in the Priests for Life case, where they talked about birth control as abortion-inducing. Now, the defense for that is that people have said, well, he was quoting somebody else. But to bring that up in your own hearing is a little bit of a flag.
So you think he's someone who's going to see birth control as beyond the pale and needs to regulate more, or going back to Griswold, you think?
I think that if they allow every state to do what they want and they chip away at all that, sure.
What about...
And of course, there are conservatives who are extremely hostile to the notion of a right to privacy, from which flows Lawrence, Texas, which is, all the anti-sodomy laws. So it affects the gay community as well. And I don't even know, what
I'm just wondering, because you're someone who, because of your Catholic background, I know has good conversations with and ties with people who are pro-life.
Mm-hmm.
In
my family.
And observing the debate at the Capitol and the people who influence the law, I guess what I'm asking is, do you think there can be enough common ground on issues like birth control to avoid unwanted pregnancies where both sides could agree?
Well, we've done it in the past. I worked with Richard Tulisano on that, and
he's the former
Judiciary chair of Judiciary
from Rocky Hill.
And I was not on the negotiating committee. I couldn't be, because I felt personally that both sides, I wasn't really fully with both sides.
What did you work on? What happened?
I did a lot of research for him, and I found a book that I thought would provide a model for our own legislation.
And what was the legislation? What was the compromise that was passed?
Um, y- there were a lot of things in it, but the bottom line was that we didn't define viability. That was really it, and it really came down to trust of the people.
Mm-hmm.
But when I know that the book that I got him was written by Marianne Glendon, who at that time was at the Vatican. She still is, and there's a story there too. There's always a story, and but she was a communitarian, and Richard was trying to find a way to resolve this because, as a former social worker, he was very sensitive that there were, even though he personally opposed abortion, that there were a lot of cases he had seen where that was really the only option. And he also thought a lot of people were hypocritical because sometimes they would say, well, there's dual intent here, so we'll weasel out of it.
But science has changed the question. By viability, I'm assuming you mean the viability of a fetus. If it were to be removed from a womb, at what point could it live?
Mm-hmm.
Given that science has changed and younger fetuses can be viable outside the womb, how do you see that changing the debate and the potential to find consensus on issues like abortion?
First of all, I always think there's hope. But second of all, I guess I'm still looking at the behavior of a whole group of men who have no control over their own behavior, who feel it's perfectly fine to have unprotected sex with women, and then to walk away from the consequences and say, oh, there's nothing that you can do here. And by the way, I'm going to use my political power also to cut off food for your kid if you have to raise that child alone. That is not conservatism. Whatever this creature is that has inhabited Washington, that level of self-indulgence and refusal to be accountable for the results of your actions is not conservative.
But it is Dateline New Haven that you're listening to on WNHH-FM, your home for community radio, on 3.5 FM live. Steve at newhavenindependent.org. We're speaking with State Representative Pat Dillon. So you talked about the creature of conservatism in Washington. What's happening in Hartford, where you're a state legislator, and happened since 1985 from the 92nd District? A survey recently came out, an anonymous survey of 593 employees, legislators, and lobbyists who work at the Capitol. And they found that most of the women there have experienced sexual harassment in the building. And they said that, the most who have experienced said it was at the hand of legislators. Mm-hmm. At least 86 people reported being harassed by a legislator, 64 reported being harassed by legislative staff, and 32 people by a lobbyist. So what do you take for that? Some people say, hey, it's not rampant. That's less than a majority of 593. Because 439 people said they haven't been harassed. Other people say that this shows there's a problem if that many people are being harassed by legislators who make the rule and they felt they couldn't report it.
Right.
What's your take on it? And what do you notice about the culture? That you've often described it to me as a very male culture at the Capitol.
Well, yeah, my first 10 or 15 years, that was, I made some powerful enemies. I mean, I got hit on a lot. That was a lot of my energy.
You got hit on a lot as a married woman at the Capitol?
Yeah.
By other legislators?
Yes.
How often?
Well, it was a very social thing then. There was a lot of drinking. A lot of people thought they had permission. And frankly, some didn't know I was a legislator. And I think there's a natural emotional thing for some men to assume that any woman should be emotionally and physically available to them.
So tell me one story about you were shocked when you were hit on as a legislator.
No.
You're not going to tell, okay.
No, because everybody...
Not a name. I'm just
almost,
wondering how it happened.
But they would be identifiable. And
okay.
Almost, and easily half of them are in the game still.
So has the culture changed? Have those men changed? Is it less easy for a legislator to hit on other legislators?
There are more women legislators. And
like when Maura Lyons became Speaker of the House, did that change anything?
Oh, God, they were brutal to her, but did that change anything?
But like when the governor and the heads of the two houses from both parties had to strike a deal on the budget, it was no longer just guys in the back room.
Right. But even when you're sitting in committee or when you're going to an event, there were very few women when I first went up there.
So how has it changed?
And they just assumed you were, maybe they thought I was an intern. I don't know.
So what has changed? You said until 10 or 15 years ago. What is different now?
There are more women legislators.
And as a result, what's different?
There are fewer people hitting on people. It sounds terrible.
No, no, I hear what you're saying. Now, what about these? What did you think about these 86 people who said their legislator has harassed them? They felt they couldn't report it. Why is that going on, and how serious is this harassment?
I did not know that that was still going on. We had a very difficult situation a couple of years ago, and
What was that?
where there was a belief that a legislator had done that, and he ended up leaving. And we had some very painful meetings among us as legislators, among us, and it. I think that a lot of cultural divides came out, where some men believe that it should be making a flirtatious remark is not a threat, or that hugging someone is not a threat.
What about hugging? When's it okay to hug?
I see that was why it's hard to write the law. I mean, a lot of
we hug all the time here at this office.
That's right.
The Independent, and people I think like it. I mean, it's often the women who do the hugging.
Yeah, but when somebody's doing that to dominate you, you know it.
Mm-hmm.
Or you're standing at a thing, and all of a sudden somebody puts his arm out like that. It's condescending, know. But the law is a blunt instrument to deal with that. You really. And I keep going back to organizing. We're very socially aware of each other, and sometimes, first of all, a lot of men don't realize how outsized an impact they have when they do things. They just think about themselves, and I mean women think about themselves too, but I mean they don't necessarily think it through. And but it's not. I'm sorry that it's as much, and it's more than I would have expected. But I can say as a legislator, there was never any place I could have gone.
How about now?
No.
When's the last time someone hit on you at the Capitol?
I don't go out much. I think it tends to be the younger women, the interns, and less in the offices. Mm-hmm. So the number has dropped. I don't know if any women legislators reported being hit on. I would think that's dropped dramatically over the years that I've been there.
Another issue you've looked at over the years, Pat, you put the first bill in about computer stalking, women who are stalked by computers. What passed? How did that affect the environment? That was before that was before social media existed when you passed that law. How has that issue changed since?
Well, it's still a way of the electronic surveillance of any kind can be used to one of the cases.
What did your law specifically put into action?
We had a stalking statute in statute already, and I was updating it because once you make a list of the things that are
covered by law,
then if you leave something out.
So you said if you're stalking somebody by computer, then that's part of it. So what has happened since then? Has there been need for other legislation, or is this an issue that doesn't need
has been updated a little bit? That really became a story because the Civil Liberties Union opposed it, and I ended up on the front page of the Times, and I really think that it's kind of interesting how the press works. First of all, nobody else had thought of it. That was important. Second of all, Newt Gingrich, remember him? He's at the Vatican now. But at the time, he was Mr., forward-thinking. He was going to do
giving his House Speaker, was giving his Republican caucus, Alvin Toffler's future shock.
Exactly, the CCDA. He was doing things on electronics and so forth. And it was very clear in my interviews with CNN and so forth that they were delirious that a woman was thinking about this because it was all the same guys. And listen, if I were covering Newt Gingrich, I would probably be thrilled that there was a woman out there in the somewhere doing it too. So I think I added something to that conversation, but it was a real problem. There were a number of women I knew through virtual networks, and this particular woman whom I knew in the Valley, who was part of one of our kind of, I don't remember what we called it. I started out on what you call Pine, which was, we didn't have a graphic user interface, and we communicated with each other through virtual networks. And there was a woman in our group who was being stalked by a a rejected boyfriend, and he kept throwing files at her and crashing her system. And that was really how the story started. I started digging into it and found a number of really alarming stories, and it turned out that there was no recourse. I think, again, we write the law in Hartford, right? But it's always going to be a blunt instrument. It's always going to have unintended consequences.
I'll give you an example. I know a female reporter who was in a town in Connecticut. This is only a couple of years ago. Wrote some stories about corruption in the town, and the head of the Republican Party writes on Twitter with his name that all she needs is a good FUCK.
Mm-hmm.
And then a reporter from the Register gives a cheer, thumbs up on it, and an activist in town who was a writer also gave a thumbs up. Was that illegal?
I think there should be some course of action at the very least, but that's stunning, really.
It's actually someone who works with me.
That did it?
No, who's the victim of that? And we're trying to figure out how to deal with it. But is that covered by law? Because that would be an example of computer harassment, right?
That's interesting. I think we'd have to look at that, but that could be, yeah. I mean, there's that statute is not used as much as it could be,
mm-hmm.
but that's a big deal. You know, I think doxing, you know, the exposing people's home phone numbers and home addresses.
And of course, when you're there, you couldn't even imagine what happens now. Anyone in public life, politician, writer, anyone's in the crosshairs, gamers, video gamers, they get, you know, really rape threats and fantasies about them, and like doxing and other kind of mass piling on against women who try to be public.
That's true. And I was startled reading what was going on in the Senate, where activists were trying to talk to Jeff Flake and Susan Collins. And Susan Collins was talking about people being violent because they were sitting in at her office and were trying to talk to her in the hallway. And, you know, a group of us were talking about it and said, good Lord, you know, I mean, someone talking to me like that is me going food shopping, you know, and I'm in the aisle and someone is saying, why did you know, and so it's, I forget how insulated they are from people.
People.
Yeah.
Well, for a few minutes left, Pat, you're running for re-election, correct?
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the top issues on your agenda if you get another term, either in this area or others?
There have been, I would really like to continue a lot of the things that we started that are really positive. I'm really worried about young people, for example. And 3 years ago, I because I chaired the health subcommittee, I set aside some dollars to create a mentoring fund in the Governor's Prevention Partnership, and it's matched by the private sector, and there are like 15 companies that have been with giving money to the Governor's Prevention Partnership for like 30 years. It started with Billy O'Neill, actually. They are just, it's something that they can choose their issues year over year. But it turned out, because it was a really gratifying experience. I mean, it's wonderful when people come to you with an idea and you say, yeah, let's try it and see if it works. And if it doesn't work, we'll see. New Haven has been one of the towns that's really embraced it. And Key Bank has partnered with New Haven's public schools. And some of the students who have been mentored spoke at this. We were invited, the delegation, I assume all of us were invited to go to a press conference many weeks ago now. I was speaking with somebody from the Prevention Partnership, and they were just giddy that New Haven is one of the towns that has really taken up the whole issue of mentoring and thought about building relationships between the private sector and our young people. Anything that really gives young people an opportunity to kind of expand their menu, to think about the choices they make.
So what actions would you take if reelected on this or other
Protect
issues?
that money.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of your job now, protecting money. We have a $5 billion estimated deficit in the next 2-year budget. Is most of what you're doing now defense?
Well, I don't think people realize how many hundreds of millions of dollars have gone out to the private sector on the other side of the budget. The instinct is always to cut the appropriation side. We're giving hundreds of millions of dollars.
Through tax breaks.
Well, yeah, I mean,
The
like
first
$400
5 programs.
million to one company. We just gave, $85 million to Electric Boat and so forth.
The idea is that creates jobs, save jobs. Do you think it's been a mistake? Is that corporate welfare that could be better used by having leaner government and a more predictable tax structure?
Well, a lot of that went to the banking sector in Fairfield County, which was.
Is that because politicians get contributions from them, or is that because it's a growing sector where people felt they're going to go somewhere else if we don't play the competition game with tax breaks?
It's because the people in charge came from Fairfield County, and they looked at our economy through the lens of the town they live in, and they also, if you're in Southern Fairfield County, you see yourself as competing with New York, let's say, and so your tendency is to throw money at companies to keep them here, and Connecticut's strategy years ago was, to lure companies from New York. We got El Grosso did that. It was General Electric. It was Union Carbide, and she did it by not having an income tax because the executives didn't want to have to pay, and they were perfectly happy to move their whole company.
So, do you agree with Bob Stefanowski, the Republican candidate for governor, that we should eliminate the income tax?
No, and he was a higher up, I believe, at USB,
and GE. He was number 2 at GE before that.
But USB got about $20 million, I believe, from the state of Connecticut, and they laid people off anyway.
And GE moved out of the state.
GE had a lot of problems on its own.
Right, they're redefining what they were, and they actually went to a higher tax state. So why do you not support eliminating income tax? Because it would take half the revenues out of our budget?
Yeah.
Okay. Are you supporting Ned Lamont, Susan Biswitz from your party, Democratic Party?
Yes, I am.
Lieutenant Governor. They are saying that they're going to cut taxes. They said they're going to cut the $250 business entity tax. They say that if we cut that tax, which would take $20 million out of our deficit-ridden budget, they said if we get rid of that tax, that will help people start small businesses. Do you agree? Do you think it's important to cut that? Does $250 make or break a business?
I have not served on finance for many years.
You're ducking the question, Pat. You can decide whether $250 makes or breaks a business.
No.
Okay, so would you cut the business entity tax?
I wouldn't go there. If somebody makes a compelling case, I might swallow it as part of a package, but it doesn't make me jump up and down excited.
Well, I'm excited that you came in today, Pat. Thanks so much for time goes fast. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. So thanks for joining us today, State Representative Pat Dillon. Thanks to Yale New Haven Hospital for providing support for today's program. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience, performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. Now, we know what it's like to be free. You just got to remember to book our flight. Fly free with us all day and all night like at WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.